So when we do what we're about to do, which is read a narrative, listen to a story, encounter an anecdote about women in Buddhism, often we have this sense that when we encounter a Buddhist text, it's like we're opening a book, that we're reading words fixed on a page, composed by a single author or narrator, preserving a single authoritative version of events. But that is not how most Buddhist stories came into being. For centuries, these stories were not books, they were voices. They were told and retold in monasteries, nunneries, around fires, around stupas, on pilgrimage routes, in village gatherings, and in communities of practitioners. They were memorized, recited, adapted, expanded, abbreviated, and then retold, which is to say they lived in relationships long before they lived on paper or on manuscript scrolls. And so in that sense, a Buddhist narrative is less like a monument carved in stone than like a river. A river has an identity. We recognize it, we name it, but we know that no two moments are exactly the same. And as a story moves through time, it carries the imprint, the fragrance of the communities that cherished it, the questions they asked of it, and the needs that they bring to it. And this is one reason we find different versions of the same story across Buddhist traditions. The Pali Canon may tell a story one way, different Sanskrit sources tell it other ways, and some of them might give different names to identifiably the same characters. Chinese translations might preserve additional details. Tibetan versions emphasize something else. And so rather than seeing these differences as a problem, we might see them as evidence that the tradition remained alive. The stories remained alive. Communities continue to listen, reflect, reinterpret, and transmit these stories because they believe that they still had something to say. And the story we'll be looking at today is one of those living narratives. But it only exists in one tradition today. One version that is almost never told. I came across it while I was doing my doctoral dissertation in India, in a Sanskrit manuscript that had been buried for centuries in a stupa in Gilgit in the north of Pakistan. I read it with a South Indian pundit who read through it with me, didn't find it particularly interesting, even though he got very engaged by many of the narratives in this particular manuscript. The manuscript is a text called the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, Vinaya being the monastic code, the Mula Sarvastivada being a tradition whose Vinaya code is particularly rich in stories. And so this particular story is part of that. And so there's this question, the fact that the pundit I read it with didn't find it particularly interesting could tell us something. Who finds what story interesting? Who's transmitting? Who's retelling? Who's asking for a retelling? And why? And right now, this particular event is taking place at Natural Dharma Foundation, a practice community founded and headed by women. Most of the people here are women. My work on this particular story has been supported by a grant from Lens Foundation, whose CEO is a woman, and they have a Women Leaders in Buddhism project that this is part of. And so what we see now is that there are contexts where certain stories that are continuing to flow in the tradition have an audience, and the audience asks for them, and events are created. But we know for a very long period of time, women were not the principal audience sponsor in the majority of spaces. So just to note that. Note that this story is part of this tradition that's like a river, but it was not told and retold in different versions that are preserved in different canons. It wasn't part of a wide flowing river, but it's trickling forward in a single stream, but it's still there. And yet, even though it's just a small stream trickling forward, it describes an incredibly important in women's history in Buddhism, in the history of people who are practicing with women or as women in Buddhist spaces. And it tells us the story of a group of women whose persistence and collaboration changed the history of Buddhism itself. And whether every conversation happened exactly as the text describes may not be the most interesting question. Maybe more interesting questions are, why did those generations of Buddhists preserve this story? Many traditions didn't, but one stream did. Why did they continue telling it? What truth were they trying to keep alive? And from this, maybe another question follows naturally. What is our responsibility as the next generation of listeners? And if these stories have always been received, interpreted, and retold in community, then our task is not simply to consume them. Our task is to enter into conversation with them, to listen carefully, to notice what moves us, what unsettles us, what inspires us, and what still asks to be understood. So today I'd like to approach this story not as a historian trying to find out what really happened, or an archaeologist examining an artifact, but as participants collectively entering into a conversation that has been unfolding for more than 2,000 years. Because stories like this don't simply preserve a tradition. They are one of the ways a tradition continues to evolve and adapt and stay relevant to new generations. And so as we read, and I want to just read through the story together, we might be attentive to how women support one another, how they respond to barriers, what forms of wisdom and courage they embody, and also how their actions shape the Dharma for future generations. And I'm going to share the text on screen, and because the story is a multivocal story, there are different people who are contributing their voices to it. I want to invite us to take turns, and for each of you, as you wish, to unmute yourself and to read one page. And there are 7 pages, so we can have 7 people reading. And you don't need to be called on, just go ahead and take yourself off.
The Lord Buddha was dwelling in the Nyagroda Park in Kapilavastu. When the Lord was establishing the Shakyas in the truths, they came to see the Lord 3 times, and he explained the Dharma to them again and again. As was the practice of King Shuddhodana, he went to see the Lord surrounded by the assembly of Shakyas. On one of those occasions, the Lord was seated in the midst of a gathering of many hundreds and taught the Dharma sweet as pure honey. The gathering of many hundreds sat with their sense faculties unwavering, listening to the sweet, sweet Dharma from the Lord. In order to hear the Dharma, King Shuddhodana, too, with his immensely kingly wealth and his great royal power, surrounded by the assembly of Shakyas, had come into the presence of the Lord. After hearing the Dharma, he left.
At that time, Mahanaman, the Shakya, generated faith upon hearing the Dharma directly from the Lord. When he returned home, he proclaimed, "Ah, the Buddha! Ah, the Dharma! Ah, the Sangha! How fruitful is the arising of the Buddha for us!" Mahanaman's senior wife said, "My husband, what is this?" He said, "Today, before an assembly of many hundreds, the Lord taught the Dharma in such a way that upon hearing it, many hundreds of thousands of beings attained great insights."
She said, "My husband, what you say, that the arising of the Buddha is fruitful for you, is true. The arising of the Buddha is fruitful only for you, not for us. That is because the arising of the Buddha in the world is for the sake of men, not for women." He said, "Good lady, don't say that. The Lord has compassion for all beings. You should go too and listen to the Dharma from the Lord in person." She said, "His Majesty approached the Lord to see him, surrounded by the assembly of Shakyas 3 times. We would feel shy listening to the Dharma directly in front of His Majesty. So if His Majesty would go in the morning, we could listen to the Dharma from the Lord in the afternoon."
For those of you who've just joined, we're taking ourselves off mute and just taking turns reading a page.
Mahanaman thought, "I will go and inform the king." But then he had the thought, it would be awkward to solicit the king on behalf of my own wife. I don't dare. However, Mahaprajapati is highly esteemed by the king. He treats anything she tells him as a command. So, should I present the matter to her? He went to where Mahaprajapati Gautami was and presented the matter to her. She said, "Let it be so. I will inform the king."
After he went home, the homeowner Mahanaman informed the wives of the Shakya men. The wives of the Shakayas and other women went to where Mahaprajapati Gautami was and said to her, "Gautami, you know what? We have heard that in front of an assembly of several hundred, the Lord teaches sweet, sweet Dharma, nectar that is as sweet as pure honey. An assembly of several hundred listens to this sweet, sweet Dharma directly from the Lord with their sense faculties unwavering. So we too want to hear the Dharma in the presence of the Lord. Please speak to the king of our matter so that the king goes before the Lord in the morning and we go in the afternoon." She said, "Sisters, this is a fine idea you have. Please wait a moment while I go see King Shuddhodana."
Then Mahaprajapati Gautami went to where King Shuddhodana was and said to him, "Do you know what, Majesty? I have heard that the Lord is teaching sweet, sweet Dharma, nectar that is sweet as pure honey, before an assembly of several hundred. This assembly of several hundred listens to this sweet, sweet Dharma directly from the Lord, with their sense faculties unwavering. The Shakya women have also heard of this, and they would like to hear the Dharma. Thus, Your Majesty should enter into the presence of the Lord in the morning, and I will take the Shakya women and enter into the presence of the Lord in the afternoon. What is the reason for this? They are occupied with housework at home in the morning, and so do not have the opportunity to enter into the presence of the Lord in the morning."
as was the practice of King Shuddhodana when Mahaprajapati Gautami was giving orders. He remained standing with his body straight as a rod, and the king did not sit down until Mahaprajapati Gautami had completed issuing her orders. With his head bowed, he said, Gautami, so shall it be. Following that, Mahaprajapati Gautami went to Niagara Park in the company of 500 Shakya women to hear the Dharma directly from the Lord.
So let's just take a moment or two and think about what moment in the story stands out. What do you notice about the way these women act together? What qualities make their transformation possible? And I want to invite anyone who has any reflections from this first reading, and we're going to read it again and again. What stands out on the first reading? What strikes you?
Two things, that there were 500 people, 500 women, 500. I mean, it started with a question from one woman to her husband, and then when they went, it was 500. And the other thing equally astonishing was how the king absolutely stood in upright respect and bowed his head to his wife. The woman behind the throne, as so often is the story. That just cracked me up, because I think of Buddhism and its history and the culture around it as being so patriarchal. But ho ho ho, maybe not. I don't know. It was fascinating.
I thought it was, I don't know, circuitous or something. There were these sort of intermediaries in each communication, like you couldn't talk directly. And then their request was in terms of they weren't able to do it because they were busy with their so they were never complaining about their place or anything, or about fairness or something like that we would do today. It was just, I don't know, couched in cultural norms or something.
Maybe one more reflection, anyone?
Hi, it's Liz. I just noticed that in this story, I was quite surprised to hear or read that the king would stand at full attention when Mahaprajapati would speak. It never occurred to me that that could ever happen back in that time.
Mm.
Yeah. So I want to go back through and do one page at a time and pull a couple of things out. And after this, I want to invite us to try a contemplative writing exercise. And in that exercise, the invitation will be to imagine ourselves inside the world of the text, and then to identify ourselves with someone, imagine ourselves into the place of someone, and tell the story or a particular moment in the story from their point of view. And you might focus on the viewpoint of one character. You might help to give more context for something that you think needed more context. Or you might retell the story in a very different way. And so that's the exercise that we'll do after a second read through now. And I just want to sort of lightly draw our attention to a couple of different points in hopes that that can sort of nourish our imaginations as we walk through it. And again, maybe different people could read different pages. And just go ahead and take a page and read it out loud. It's okay if you've read one page before, you can do another one.
The Lord Buddha was dwelling in the Nyagroda Park in Kapilavastu. When the Lord was establishing the Shakyas in the truths, they came to see the Lord 3 times, and he explained the Dharma to them again and again. As was the practice of King Shuddhodana, he went to see the Lord surrounded by the assembly of Shakyas. On one of those occasions, the Lord was seated in the midst of a gathering of many hundreds and taught the Dharma, sweet as pure honey. The gathering of many hundreds sat with their sense faculties unwavering, listening to the sweet, sweet Dharma from the Lord. In order to hear the Dharma, King Shuddhodana, too, with his immense kingly wealth and his great royal power, surrounded by the assembly of Shakyas, had come into the presence of the Lord. After hearing the Dharma, he left.
So I want to just think on this page a little bit about what is the scenario that's being painted. All of the eminent men in the city, all of the powerful people, all of the royal pomp and demonstration of we could say, the elite power of the town has gone out, and they're receiving the Dharma. We can also think about what it means that the narrator here is highlighting the sweetness, this sensual element, this pleasurable or desirable element. And so in a way, we can ask about how is listening to the Dharma being offered as an object that we might desire. How is that being played with here through the sensual imagery? Maybe someone else like to read?
At that time, Mahanaman, the Shakya, generated faith upon hearing the Dharma directly from the Lord. When he returned home, he proclaimed, "Ah, the Buddha! Ah, the Dharma! Ah, the Sangha! How fruitful is the arising of the Buddha for us!" Mahanaman's senior wife said, "My husband, what is this?" He said, "Today, before an assembly of many hundreds, the Lord taught the Dharma in such a way that upon hearing it, many hundreds of thousands of beings attained great insights."
So, we know that Mahanaman's senior wife is the one who puts in motion the chain of events. She lights the first spark. And women began receiving the Dharma, and the Dharma became taught, for us, those of us who identify as women, thanks to her. A massively important event in the history of Buddhism. And what is her name? We don't know. She's not named. And you hear, she's about to question it in the next page, but you hear him saying, how fruitful is the arising of the Buddha for us? Right? It's very important question of who is us?
Mhm.
Who is the unstated us? And who recognizes that they are not part of that us? What does it take when someone says us and they're your partner? And you are able to recognize, you have enough awareness of the dynamics to recognize that is not an inclusive us. So let's look at how that plays out on the next page. Someone else like to read?
She said, my husband, what you say that the arising of the Buddha is fruitful for you is true. The arising of the Buddha is fruitful only for you, not for us. That is because the arising of the Buddha in the world is for the sake of men, not for women. She said, good lady, don't say that. The Lord has compassion for all beings. You should go too and listen to the Dharma from the Lord in person. She said, His Majesty approached to the Lord to see him, surrounded by the assembly of Shakyas 3 times. We would feel shy listening to the Dharma directly in front of His Majesty. So if His Majesty would go in the morning, we could listen to the Dharma from the Lord in the afternoon.
And so here we see exactly what she's detecting when she calls him out on the us. And this is this use of representation in language and who is being represented and who the category claims to represent, but who's actually being excluded is something that we see in the use of the term mankind, and we're sort of at a point where we, I think, are fairly attentive to it. But this text, was most likely redacted 2,000 years ago. The manuscript, this particular manuscript, is at least 15 centuries ago. And we have the woman calling this out, having an awareness of distinction of gender. And as you go on, of course, Mahanaman is horrified because, we know it's a catchphrase that we repeat again and again and again in different scriptures, the teacher of gods and humans, or gods and men, right? And so the idea is that the teachings are universal, they're for all beings. And Mahanaman's wife is saying if they're all for all beings, then they have to be taught to all beings. But that her explanation is something that we see being reworked later in the story, that it has to do with feeling shy. It has to do with the discomfort that a respectable woman might feel going out into mixed company, going out into public. And it's interesting to track in the story who moves through the public realm, who leaves the house. And we can notice none of the women in the story are shown in the story, at least, leaving the house. Mahanaman goes out and goes to see the queen, and she works within the palace. Mahanaman's wife intervenes with Mahanaman within his house. And so the sense that gender roles are very clearly marked and gender spaces are distinguished is part of what's going on here. The internal feeling of being inhibited by going against gender norms is being signaled in the idea of feeling shy, that we would feel like we would feel shy, or we would feel ashamed, we feel uncomfortable. And so that the question of how our discomfort leads us through internalizing gender norms to behave in ways that are being stipulated by the structure and that are maybe not in our interest. And let's see what happens next.
Mahanaman thought, I will go and inform the king. But then he had the thought, it would be awkward to solicit the king on behalf of my own wife. I don't dare. However, Mahaprajapati is highly esteemed by the king. He treats anything she tells him as a command, so I should present the matter to her. He went to where Mahaprajapati Gautami was and presented the matter to her. She said, let it be so. I will inform the king.
So we notice that he's moving through the public space. But one thing to notice here is that in this story, and it's fairly common in Buddhist narratives, that we're getting description and dialogue. We don't get a lot of internal monologue reported. There are a few very notable moments in the Vimalakirti Sutra. There's some very interesting moments where the narrator tells us what Vimalakirti is thinking, and those are unusual and noteworthy. But in this particular story, the narrator is only giving us access directly to the inner world of one of the two male characters in this story, Mahanaman. So that's just something to notice, where the narrators are comfortable entering and where they're not entering. But we also see here something that I think is quite interesting to track and to think about, is that he doesn't say he would be shy or ashamed, but he does say it would be awkward to solicit the king on behalf of my own wife. So, we can ask ourselves, how is he also being bound by his own gender expectations that a man doesn't go and, advocate on behalf of his wife to the king? So there's a kind of interesting parallel that works in very different ways. And there's this decision that he makes that he'll get a woman to advocate for women. He'll go to Mahaprajapati. And he knows what the narrator will later show us, that she's the boss in that relationship. And, the fact that she is able to command is noteworthy. But how does she exercise her command? What does she have to do? She's not the power on the throne. She's the power behind the throne, indirectly. And so that may reveal to us just the basic fact that there are powerful women in the world and there are powerful men. And it comes, there are all different kinds of private relationships that evolve. People of any gender can have different kinds of qualities. But who is the one who makes the decisions about what happens? How do they make those decisions? Is it the ability to command, or do they have to influence a man who is holding the main power? And there's a real question there. Is this supportive of the patriarchy? That you go and whisper, or you privately tell the king what you think should be done, and then the king executes it? Is that supportive of the patriarchy, patriarchal structures? Does it actually erode them? Is it a way of working with them? Does it challenge them? These are questions for us to bring to our reading of the story, and to see what the story seems to think about it, and also what we seem to think about it. And so then there's an interesting shift. We don't know exactly what he tells Mahaprajapati. He presents the matter to her. We don't know how he presented it, but we know how it was presented to him. It was presented as a matter of social awkwardness, sharing space between men and women. So let's watch how Mahaprajapati chooses to present it. But oh no, first we have to see something else more important. Someone like to read? Actually, I'm going to read this one. After he went home, the homeowner Mahanaman informed the wives of the Shakya men. The wives of the Shakyas and other women went to where Mahaprajapati Gautami was and said to her, Gautami, you know what? We've heard that in front of an assembly of several hundred, the Lord teaches sweet, sweet Dharma, nectar that is sweet as pure honey. An assembly of several hundred listens to this sweet, sweet Dharma directly from the Lord with their sense faculties unwavering. So we too want to hear the Dharma in the presence of the Lord. Please speak to the king of our matter so that the king goes before the Lord in the morning and we go in the afternoon. She said, Sisters, this is a fine idea you have. Please wait a moment while I go see King Shuddhodana. So this is an interesting point to consider. Mahaprajapati had told Mahanaman, I will talk to the king. But she doesn't go. She doesn't go right away. She only goes after a group of women have come and made the request to her. And once they do, she goes immediately. And this is one of the questions that I have for this text, and I would love to hear your reflections. Why do you think she wants to wait or needs to wait or decides to wait until it's not just Mahanaman coming and making the request, but actually the women themselves come? Any thoughts about that?
I just wonder, when he went and made the request and she said, I will go, present this to the king. I don't know, like, how long did it take before all these women showed up? Was she thinking about how she was going to present it to the king, maybe? Or did she say she'd present it, but she wasn't sure she was going to? I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about.
I
And it
also
must
want,
have taken some time for all these women to gather. I mean, that to me it seems like it would take time.
I also wondered if when she received the first request, that she thought, oh, well, this is one man and he's concerned about his wife's interest. And we don't know what she thought of some woman being interested in going to this place, which was just for men, and wanting to hear, maybe, I don't know if she was interested or if she thought this was an anomaly, and just let it slip from her mind. And then when suddenly there were lots of women saying, yes, we want to hear this. Oh, well, okay. And then she went to her husband to present this to him. I just is one possibility that crossed my mind.
I also wonder if she felt herself more empowered and inspired by like this big community of women, that would then sort of be behind her in this. And she also heard their passion for it in the way that they talked about it, the sweetness and the purity and just their real desire came through in this.
I think it might also speak to the power differential here. I'm wondering if perhaps she felt that I've got to be judicious with the requests I make because her power was relatively limited. And it, consistent with what Heather just shared, it took the encouragement that a lot of women would benefit from this for her to decide. There's an expression you'll hear in politics, like you have a limited amount of political capital to spend. And maybe it took that extra, the requests from all those women for her to decide, okay, this is worthy of me spending some capital on.
I was thinking that also the maybe the impact of getting of being able to go and listen to the teachings will be different if you feel like, oh, I made this possible, like my voice was heard, and that's why we are here. So it's very different than being sent by your husband. Yeah, you go and listen, now you have the permission to do it. It's very different how you will receive it.
It sounded like there was a lot of judiciousness by all concerned, and having a whole group of women saying this is what they want is just a much stronger statement, and relieves both the women, the individual women involved and the individual men involved, of some kind of cultural pressures.
I agree with what's being said. I think that Mahapajapati wanted to kind of read the room. She didn't want to take the statement or recommendation of just Mahanaman as something she would run with. I think she probably wanted to read the agency of the women themselves and their intention. And as some of you have said, she didn't want to take this message to the king if the women were simply being, encouraged or pushed by their husbands. She wanted to read the agency and the passion, which in this story, I really feel the passion of the women herself. And I think that carried her into her decision to see the king.
Well, let's see what happens when she goes to see the king. And we can keep all of these different possibilities in play as we read.
Then Mahapajapati Gautami went to the king, Suddhodana, where King Suddhodana was, and said to him, "Do you know what, Majesty? I have heard that the Lord is teaching sweet, sweet Dharma, nectar that is sweet as pure honey, before an assembly of several hundred. This assembly of several hundred listens to this sweet, sweet Dharma directly from the Lord, with their sense faculties unwavering. The Sakya women have also heard of this, and they would like to hear the Dharma. Thus, Your Majesty should enter into the presence of the Lord in the morning, and I will take the Shakya women and enter into the presence of the Lord in the afternoon. What is the reason for this? They are occupied with housework at home in the morning, and so do not have the opportunity to enter into the presence of the Lord in the morning."
So this was also really striking. No one talked about them being busy in the morning and they could come in the afternoon. This is the first we're hearing of this suggestion. Right? And I just wonder why you think it's presented that way. What is your take on it?
I think it's skillful means. I think they're just trying to fit this new model into an existing model that would be very tricky to penetrate, very tricky to manipulate or overcome. And I think the women are being very clever and skillful in saying, well, we'll just go at different times. I'm not sure it's about housework. It might be. But that's a conventional kind of thing to say that the king could hear, and he would probably agree with that. I think the women have shown skillful means throughout this story.
Mm.
I think it might, oh, sorry. Go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. Yep.
I thought that it might also take away any sort of like You know how when another sort of suppressed group is rising up, there can be fear from the people who are in power of that shift of, and so it kind of demonstrates like, well, we're still good housewives, we're still doing our, you know, our wifely or housewife sort of duty, so don't worry, like we're still recognizing our place, and staying within some bounds of our expected roles.
Do we have one more reflection before we move on?
I also think that maybe she's thinking about this progression of change, not making a radical change or a step that will, I don't know, create a lot of disorder, but I think Mahaprajapati is thinking about making this progression and making this progressive that will not burn out everything.
It seems it would really further the cause of the women doing it that way, because then there's no threat to the men.
Mm-hmm.
And even going at the same time could be problematic. So take that out of the picture too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also, you know, the other thing that comes to my mind about that is that, you know, Mahanaman didn't seem to understand any of the restrictions, inner restrictions or outer restrictions. He said, oh, well, why don't you go? You should just come too.
Mm.
And, you know, to say my embarrassment, my shyness is what holds me back is one thing, but it's quite another thing to say, well, I would, but I'm working in the morning. So, you know, you go in the morning, I'll go in the afternoon. I also notice about this, the way that Mahaprajapati, she does this thing that I think in sales is like, I don't know what it's called, but you just assume that he's going to say yes and you tell him how it's going to happen. So she's not asking permission. She's just saying, well, there's this problem and this is how to solve it, rather than leaving open any possibility that maybe we're just going to continue as things are. So we see all different forms of skill and wisdom and courage in this story. Let's take the next step.
As was the practice of King Suddhodana when Mahaprajapati Gautama was giving orders, he remained standing with his body straight as a rod. And the king did not sit down until Mahaprajapati Gautami had completed issuing her orders. With his head bowed, he said, Gautami, so shall it be. Following that, Mahaprajapati Gautami went to Nayagroda Park in the company of 500 Shakya women to hear the Dharma directly from the Lord.
I want to propose this contemplative writing exercise that a friend of mine, Georgia Kashnik, suggests. And this comes from the Women in Buddha's Life website, and Wendy Garling is one of the contributors and co-creators of that website. So it's really lovely to see you here, Wendy. And the suggestion for this exercise, and I'm going to give an alternative if you're not a writer or don't connect with this exercise. I'm going to give the alternative of going into breakout rooms and having conversation for those who would prefer that. But as we think about the story as a living narrative that generations have added to, have drawn certain things out from, have reshaped for new purposes over time. And we can think of our place in that stream as people who are keeping that story alive. And one of the ways of keeping a story alive is to retell it from new perspectives and with new voices. So the idea is that we imagine ourselves, and we'll take a moment or two to sort of feel our way into the space of the narrative, that we think about some character whose experience or whose contribution we find interesting. We could think about someone who wasn't there, who wasn't part of it, but hears about it later and is retelling it. We can imagine ourselves retelling certain exchanges in a different way. Or we might want to provide an explanation as part of the story for something that happened that we feel didn't really get fleshed out in the way that we wanted. And so let's take 12 minutes. And the breakout group option would be, we can go into groups of 3 for those 12 minutes and just to talk through, how does it feel to enter into the world of these first Buddhist women? How does it feel to enter into this world? And then we could imagine, if this were performed as a play, what part would you like to play and why? And what details you might add about the person's experience if you were doing that. And the questions will be dropped into the chat. So if you go into breakout rooms, you'll have them to refer to. And I just want to take a moment to imagine ourselves into this world. You know, we're reading through the stories as people who are seated in front of this text. And we're wondering about what was going on in the events behind the text as it was being described. So let's just connect for a moment with the bodies that we have right now. However they're seated is fine. However they're shaped is fine. And we can feel the weight of our body responding to the call of the earth below where we're seated. Feel that contact of our feet or our seat. And we can imagine that if we were seated on the other side of this planet in Nepal, in Kapilavastu, we can imagine ourselves with these same bodies, also feeling our weight and responding to the call of the earth below us. But the smell surrounding us would be different. We might hear different bird calls. You might smell different flowers, the perfume of mango trees. The light might look different. The buildings would be different. The streets would be different. Our clothes would be different. And so just taking this as one imaginative step into that world, we can take up our paper and pen, or into a keyboard and fresh document, or you could have the option of going into a breakout group and just take about 12 minutes to do some free writing. You'll be back here at 11:32. And as we come back into this space together, those of you who did some writing, maybe you could share in the chat whose perspective you wrote from and any particular details or viewpoint that you want to share. While those whose story is too good to be put down are wrapping up. And hopefully if it was inspiring, you might continue to do more writing on this later.
I have a message that the chats have been disabled. Can that be changed?
While we're waiting, instead of waiting for that, why don't we just go ahead and one or two people can just take themselves off mute and share if they like.
What I love about this story is how different it is. It's really an anomaly in many ways. And what I feel in this story is we're seeing so much contrast to not just the usual stories of patriarchy, but our assumptions and projections about the way patriarchy behaved at that time. And I think a lot of that came into the writing over time from others. I would say what I love about this story is how we're getting a window into the relationships of husband and wife, both in terms of Mahanaman and his wife and Ma Prajapati and her husband, and how respectful and even gentle and kind these relationships are. And they're not the usual authoritative, women belong in the kitchen, what's wrong with you? You're too stupid to understand the Dharma kind of things, which we find in other stories. But they're actually very heartfelt, at least from Mahanaman. He really became his wife's advocate, and he really, really wanted to respond to her, even though he seemed to be clueless in the beginning that she had been excluded. Probably he wasn't really, but and then we see Ma Prajapati speaking to her husband, and he listened and he responded. For whatever reason, maybe he just took orders from her. Maybe he was a really kind man who felt some compassion once he woke up to the passion of all the Shakya women, who, he was their king and he probably wanted to make them happy. I just find this story extremely unusual in terms of the way men and women are portrayed together, however, in their roles, but there is so much respect flowing back and forth. And I'm reminded of the stories that tell us that the council of elders that made decisions really beyond the king's authority in Kapilavastu was composed of men and women. And I think that's an important point too, showing how men and women were held in different roles, but with, I'll just take a stab at saying equal respect. And in many cases, it's the women's voices that we hear in those stories too. So when I drop into this story or into that story world, I kind of long for that, that kind of mutual respect between genders, even though, it's going to take a long time to break through the roles.
Yes, Liz.
I focused on Maha Prajapati, and I thought that, yes, it wouldn't have been enough for her to go to the king with just one person's wife. But I was interested in this time before internet and cell phones. How do you reach out and get 500 women to sort of even know about this? So I imagine that Maha Prajapati loved the idea from the beginning because she herself would so long to go see her stepson teach. And so I imagine that she could put together a group, like just hold a gathering for a small group of women. This is where my imagination, and that they sort of instilled the idea with them. And if they're enthused, then that word of mouth could definitely, I could see how that could spread quickly, and she could get the feedback that she needed so that she could go to the king and say, all these women are interested in hearing our stepson speak because they've heard of the beautiful honey-like teachings. And so I imagined that as being the way that she could do that. And then I imagined her going into phase 2, which is in this time where there are certainly rules and no easy transportation. I imagine her figuring how and when could you actually make this pilgrimage to the park, which I don't think was that close where he was teaching. It was a pretty long walk. So I just imagined her in wearing that hat, creating all the means and the protection and everything that would be needed for this group of women to traverse a certain geographical distance. And that's what I thought through.
Thank you, Liz. I want to take that as a bridge to think about Mahaprajapati. So we know that she was the sister of the Buddha's biological mother. She raised the Buddha. She breastfed him. She cared for him. So she was foster mother and aunt. And she also went on to become the first nun. And she was the head of the female monastic order for her during the course of her lifetime. And so this takes us into another question, which is the question of intersectionality, that not all women are the same. Some women have more social power than others, and she's the queen. And not only is she the queen, this story gives us really vivid evidence that she's a commanding presence. She has personal power, and she is not afraid to use it. She also has skill. And it also, all the power that she has, we still see her power as needing to be wielded in private, and her power is consisting in influencing the man. And when I told this story to another group, and when I did, there was a really interesting comment, and the person who made the comment is not here, but she commented that she was looking at how requests of people with power, requests of people who have power, have to be modified in order to be acceptable, to work within those systems of power. And so we call it skillful means, and we call it the way of the world. But this person suggested it might also be called lying. It could be, described as that is not the real reason. You're presenting it in a different way than we all know it is in order to get a result. And so that's just something for us to reflect on as we're looking at what needs to happen to bring about change. And, I think this is a central concern of this story, and it's a concern that we may share here. How do we reorient or adapt the social context of the transmission of the Dharma so that it does create more places and conditions for women's liberation? And when we're reading the story, one of the things to ask ourselves is, who has agency? How do they wield that agency? How many people need to come together in order for it to be enough agency to make change? And I want to just very quickly ask, I don't know if the chat is enabled for everyone to write in the chat yet, but let's list out, if we could, all of the people who contribute their agency to get the Buddha to teach to women for the first time. So who are all the people that we know of whose collaboration, let's say, in this collective effort to bring about change needed to happen? How many people were contributing to that change? In other words, who are the agents involved here in making this change? Mahanaman? Mahanaman's unnamed wife, absolutely. The 500 women. Ananda is not noted in this story, so I think we can leave him out of this context. He may not even be around yet. This is quite certainly before he became Buddha's attendant, so we can imagine him as present but not an agent in what's going on here. Who else? Mahaprajapati and the king. Whose agency is not on display in this story? The Buddha. The Buddha is not exercising any agency here. He is presented as someone almost like a robot who you push the button and he teaches to whoever's in front of him. Or we could say someone who's simply responding to conditions and not intervening in them. And I think that's really something that's interesting to notice. And so in the time we have left, I think rather than go into breakout rooms, since there's not that much time left, I want to invite some reflection as a group, and we can do this because there are not that many of us, to think about what these, let's start with the first question. What might be different if this and other stories about women in early Buddhism had been narrated regularly in our Buddhist communities? And then, if we have time, it would also be interesting for us to think where in our lives we've experienced the power of women acting together to create change or the difficulties in doing it. I hear your laughter. So let's start with, let's imagine. What if this story that's just trickling forward through the traditions, just limping along, embedded in one volume in the Tibetan canon that I certainly never heard narrated, and I never heard of anyone else narrating it. You find it, just kind of lying dormant in one of the texts, and then here it is. It comes to life. It invites us in. It asks questions of us. How would we experience, ourselves as women, or our community as inclusive of women, if this story and other stories about women in the early Buddhist community were part of what we just hear on a routine basis? What do you think?
I think of them as seeds that would be planted anew and that would give the stories fresh opportunity to grow and flourish and take on meaning. And I really hope that happens. I think these stories are coming forth of women through a number of more contemporary means. And I think, my dream is that these stories do begin to be told in Dharma centers and teachers, even listen to my voice, male teachers, teaching these stories and trying to be more inclusive in addressing the audiences in Dharma centers and so forth. But I think that these would be seeds that could grow in these, if you will, role models or these archetypes of conversations between men and women that are respectful, albeit maybe they had different roles, but they equally respected, the men equally respected in this story women's ability to understand the Dharma, which was often challenged in other contexts, and their right, the validity of their passion to hear the Dharma. And I think if these seeds could grow again in Dharma communities, it could take on real momentum.
I think that it may have a double or multiple impact. Of course, like I agree with Wendy about the seeds, and that's super important. But also in my experience, when I'm very exposed of how things were in some, for example, as a queer person in the community I grew up in, I know how the community respond. So I was sure I wanted to be far away from that kind of responses. So I think it's not so straightforward. Like you hear this and now you feel like the natural result, it's not inclusiveness. Because for me, at least in my experience, when I very exposed of the consequences or the way people like me were not taking seriously or their opinions were not important, I also feel kind of pushed away, or I feel like, okay, I'm not going to fight against this. Like I'm going to put my energy somewhere else where I can really enjoy what I'm doing. Like without feeling I'm just going around the thing I'm fighting against. I want to go away from it. Yeah.
I want to
Is there a time for?
Yeah, adelante. Sí. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, I feel similar to Gabi, because if these stories are not taken with a critical lens as you are presenting them, it will be like, yeah, Buddhism was never involved in patriarchy. Buddhism was always like inclusive, and the history tells us that that is not the true, I think. So I think it has this, it will be beautiful if more communities are involved with them, but how? Like, how are they getting involved with those stories to justify or to just tell that Buddhism is inclusive and women or other genders were never apart, or how are we going to take these stories? I think will be also a question, not just taking the story, but how.
Thank you. Thank you all for these different ways to think about it. And I want to, as maybe one last question before we move towards final reflections. The story, we can engage with the parts of the story that feel very liberating and encouraging and empowering. But we also do have, I think, the shadow of the Buddha's absence from these decisions kind of kind of lingering through the story. And one way to read the story, one of the interesting ways to read stories is to put them into conversation with other stories. And I can see, Richard, why you thought of Ananda, because there is this, the story that most people have heard about Mahaprajapati is how the Buddha did not want to give her monastic ordination. And then Ananda intervened on her behalf. And that allowed it to happen. And so there are these stories where, Buddhist communities end up making places for women. But when we put these two stories in conversation, the Buddha was not the one who brought that about in either case. It had to be arranged through very considerable efforts on the part of women. And when we think about this story in which Mahaprajapati went and spoke to the king, and she had, all the power structures in place, and the men make the decisions, and they decide, and they inform the Buddha who's coming and who's not coming. And the women can go and they can influence those men to get things done. By the time Mahaprajapati is asking for ordination, King Shuddhodana is not alive anymore. Kapilavasta's social structure has been quite literally decimated. There's been, a lot of political destabilization. And you have this other situation where Mahaprajapati doesn't have access to the men that she normally can go and influence to get things done. So she tries to go to the Buddha, and he is not willing to say yes. And then Ananda, who's basically her kind of nephew to her, and maybe you could say a subject in the kingdom, is the one who influences matters on her behalf. And so this story does leave us with the complicated, if not problematic, lack of action on the part of the Buddha. I mean, who notices that the women are not coming to the teachings? It doesn't seem to be the Buddha. Who sees that as an issue, that steps need to be taken to change? It's not the Buddha. And so this also opens a different kind of question for us about the role of persistence, the role of collective action, the role of, not just gender roles, but also social roles. There was a Mahaprajapati, a force to be reckoned with in the city in which she is a force to be reckoned with as, as the queen behind the throne and as the Buddha's mother, as she's referred to in later texts. And so as we're turning to these texts for inspiration and for reflection, I think it is interesting to think about where change is coming from and where it's not coming from. And what is the invitation that makes to us as people who are part of the stream? The stories that we ask to have narrated, the ways we engage with those stories, those of you who took the exercise to rewrite the story. Every translation is a retelling. Every retelling is a retelling. And what are we inspired by and what are we troubled by when we read the story? Those are all things for us to be thinking about. And, I would like to hear, before we close with the final thought, why do you think the Buddha did not speak up to arrange spaces for women? This is his mother who raised him. He's gone back to Kapilavastu and he's teaching all the men there. And does he not notice she didn't come? Does he not? What do you imagine? And we're using our imagination here. But what kinds of explanations can we give? And I want to put that out there as something that requires some explanation.
I thought he was being, I was going to say judicious, but he was not trying to mix his message up with social change and get in the middle of any, it's almost like conflict avoidance or something, but he wanted to just do what he was doing. And if he was like Jesus Christ, I mean, he got killed because he objected to certain behaviors and got angry about all the money in the temple and that sort of thing. So I think the Buddha was being uninvolved in that.
I think the Buddha had his eye on the long game. And I think what I see as skillful means here, you can't undo a social structure that he was obviously very familiar with by snapping your fingers and becoming an authoritative figure who says, oh, by the way, women have to be allowed and I want them to show up tomorrow or whatever. I think that would have created karmically a backlash, kind of a pushback and resentment and so forth, all that kind of thing. I think he always had his eye on women being part of the Fourfold Sangha. And I think we have, origin stories that support that. But I think he had the confidence that it would come, but it had to come from the grassroots. It had to come from the bottom up. And the women, rather than being tapped on the shoulder and saying, now you're allowed to go, they had to feel it. They had to want it. And that will create more endurance of the Dharma than just being told by their husbands they have to go to teachings or, okay, you can go to teachings. I think it was skillful means. I think that about the ordination. I don't think he ever meant to exclude women. I think it was a process. And frankly, I think he and Mahapajapati both understood it that way, that it was a process of slowly eroding, if you will, or undoing this structure or these points of view without being an authoritative figure, which would have, I think, blown it all up. I think it would have been very destructive if he had taken authoritative position on either of those subjects. And that's why Mahapajapati's role was so important. And I think mother and son had a deep understanding of what was unfolding. I don't think, in my personal experience with these stories, I think it was an understanding they both had that this would take time and this would take movement and change from the bottom up to be enduring. And the Fourfold Sangha finally did come together. But it wasn't going to be easy for the women to become a part of it without some really careful, skillful, and compassionate view of how to let it unfold.
I agree with Wendy completely, but I also just want to say that every time I read about the Buddha and Ananda pleading for women to be there, I don't necessarily trust these older translations. Do you know that almost all the scriptures or things that have been written after the time were never good to women? And so I don't even necessarily completely trust what I read. And I do agree with Wendy that skillful means had to be involved at that time for the completely deferential. This is the first time I've ever read that the men respected women, so it's beautiful. But mostly you learn that in that society, women were treated like your cow or something. I mean, it's like possessions. So, lots of them in the house, but not necessarily esteemed. So this is exciting change, what you've come up with here. Just want to say.
I think there is an element of skillful means, and I very much appreciate that perspective and think it's part of the dynamics that were going on here, particularly given the culture that the Buddha was embedded in.
Exactly.
I also have to wonder, though, clearly he was a remarkable person and a gifted teacher to whom I'm indebted, but I have to leave open the possibility that some of it was just patriarchy and chauvinism. That even in his greatness, perhaps he was shaped by the milieu he grew up in. And part of what would make me think that would be if you look at the number of rules for the bhikkhunis versus the bhikkhus and the nature of some of those rules, I think it's hard to argue there was complete equality there. That's just my perspective. Thank you.
If we have time, I think I have to concur with Richard, and maybe I'm just a cynic. I deeply appreciate much of what I've learned about the teachings of Buddhism. So I don't mean this to be blasphemy or something like that, but what Wendy said attributes to him the Lord, and I don't even know if the Lord is Shakyamuni Buddha. It is. Okay. So that's attributing omniscience to him. And it's always been taught that I've heard that he's not considered a god. He was a man. He was a human being who, after much, much effort, achieved some insight and enlightenment from all that effort. And I think he was like the rest of us. I don't think human beings have changed all that much. We are a product of our heredity and environment, as my mother used to say. And I think he's very much a product of his environment and was against the idea of women. And to say that, oh, this was skillful means that he could see a thousand years in the future is giving him the omniscience of a god. And I don't think that's not what I understand of who Buddha was. And I think that he was a product of his social culture, as we all are. And it made me think of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of all the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all men. And it didn't mean all men, and it didn't mean all human beings. It meant all white men and landowners at that, not just all white men. And I just think that what has happened is what has happened over the centuries, that women wanted to be involved, like the women in the story, and they wanted to hear the teachings, and eventually it came about. And you're here teaching us, and this is an amazing story, and I am very grateful, and thank you so much for allowing the conversation too.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank every single voice that's made itself heard here, including the voices of Mahanaman's wife and Mahaprajapati. This is one of the beauties, I think, of thinking through Buddhism or feeling our way through Buddhism through narratives. As we saw here, the stories bring together different voices and they make space for different understandings, different approaches. We can all be members of an audience without erasing our different perspectives, our different readings. And the way in which, for me, the coming together of many different members of the community of the town of Kapilavastu was necessary somehow, for some reason. It was necessary for all of those participations to gather and to collaborate and to lend their momentum to this moment, to me, is a reminder both of our responsibility for the shape that the Dharma is taking and also for the possibility of joining forces and identifying the conditions that we're in and asking what is beneficial now, what is needed now, and understanding that this is a living tradition. The river is not flowing beside us, it's flowing through us as we engage in Buddhist practice and participate in Buddhist communities. And to me, I think the place that I want to come with this story is to recognize that the women in this story were not simply asking for a place within history. Through their persistence and through their coming together, they became part of the force that created history. And as we understand ourselves also to be part of a historic movement in a particular place and time that is transmitting something, I think that's a very interesting and compelling invitation to us to think about what our persistence and what our collaboration could offer to the way and the directions that this great flowing river is taking in our times. So thank you so much for all of these reflections. I'm definitely thinking about this story a lot and will be incorporating these in my own thinking, and I've just really appreciated the invitation from Natural Dharma Fellowship to be able to share these stories. And I also want to acknowledge the possibility to be able to dedicate time to developing the translation and the storytelling to the Lens Foundation that made possible for me to work on this. So thanks to everyone here. Thanks to all the people who aren't here. And thank you.